everyone. Good evening. Can everyone hear me? My name is Christopher Miller. I'm the manager of program initiatives. And I would like to welcome all of you to the first Freedom Lecture in the series this year. I would like to take the time to acknowledge board members that we may have here in attendance. I believe we have our co-chair of our board, Mr. Tom Crane. Thank you for being here, sir. We also have board member Sean Brothers, who is in attendance. And
Judge Jones.
And Judge Nathaniel Jones. So we are in good company. And I believe we also have Dr. John Bryan as well, who's the honorary board. And on behalf of our staff, volunteers, we want to thank you for taking the time to be here for this very meaningful discussion that we will have here today. I would also like to take the time to, I believe we have Brad, who's here from Cincy Magazine, who is our media sponsor. I want to thank you for your sponsorship and helping us promote. And as always, a big thank you to John and Francie Pepper for this presentation. Just some housekeeping. If you're in need of using the restroom, there aren't any restrooms here on the second floor. You must go all the way down to the first floor or go back up to the third floor, okay? If you don't mind, I'm going to go take us back in time a little bit. Is that okay? 1827. In 1827, the Freedmen's Journal was the first black newspaper in this country. It took direct aim at American oppressors and championed the struggle for freedom. The editors of this publication wrote, "Too long have others spoken for us. Too long has the public been deceived by misrepresentation in things which concern us dearly." The paper was strongly abolitionist, and it also sought to give voice and pride to African-American communities. The Defender is a part of the lineage when we talk about black journalism. The Defender emerged during a time period called the nadir of African-American history, the decades of disappointment. After the Civil War, it was a time for many black communities that struggled with a lot of lynchings taking place and a lot of oppressive behaviors in this country. And so the Defender played a very significant role in addressing these issues and tackling the challenges that were before the black community at that time. Here in Cincinnati, we have our own legendary newspaper, the Cincinnati Herald. And so at this time, I would like to bring up Jan Michelle Kearney, who is the current publisher for the Cincinnati Herald, as well as Ms. Margie Parham, who is the founder of the publisher American.
Thank you, Chris. Good evening, everybody. So I know everyone's here to hear Ethan, and we are too. But when John said, well, why don't you say a few words about the Herald? You know, we can never say no. We're always happy to talk about the Cincinnati Herald. And so I'm really, really excited that Marjorie Parham is here. So her husband, Gerald Porter, started the Herald in 1955. And it was not the first black paper in Cincinnati. Black papers here started way back in the mid-1800s. But he did start the Cincinnati Herald in 1955. He passed in 1963. Unfortunately, he was in a car accident. He was taken to a hospital. The hospital would not treat him. By the time he was taken to another hospital, it was too late. And then Mrs. Parham, unfortunately, this horrible situation, took over with her son, Bill Spillers, and they continued. And she has a whole story about how she got Bill out of the Army. she called somebody in the White House. I don't know how that happens, and somehow got them to come home. So she and Bill kept the paper going. Our company, Sesh Communications, bought it in 1996. And so Mrs. Parham is now our publisher, emerita. We have, I always say we have a small but mighty staff, really, really dedicated folks. Our editor just had surgery last week, so he wanted to apologize to John and Francie. He's back at work, but only working kind of half days this week. But you know, he's doing great, so he wanted to just say he was sorry he's not here. But anyway, I know you want to hear from Mrs. Parham. She doesn't mind me telling her age, right? She will be 100 years old in February. And I was telling Ethan, I said, you know, we're not going to talk a lot. And he said, well, does Mrs. Parham talk a lot? I'm like, she's very feisty. So she's still very, very feisty. But I know you'd like to hear from her, so I would like to bring her to the microphone.
I don't know what's so great about being 99. It just means that it doesn't mean that you've accomplished, it only means that you've endured. One of the great pages of my life right now is seeing what Jan does with the Cincinnati Herald. Because I put a lot of years, and a lot of my life, and a lot of hard work, and a lot more hard knocks into the publishing of the Cincinnati Herald, and it does my heart good to see it thriving. I really don't know what you all want to hear about. I think I would rather you'd ask me, because I really have nothing I want to orate about.
Well, I think you know what John was asking you about why it was so important to have the Cincinnati Herald.
Oh, why was it important? Why it's still important. And appears to be going to continue to be important, simply because the major publications do not seek the accomplishments of the Black community. Now, you commit a crime, or do something outrageous, or like that, you get lineage in the daily press. But your accomplishments, your children's accomplishments, your graduations, your weddings, all of the things that are important within your community, the majority press does not recognize. If you send it to them, they might give you a little lineage, but they never seek you out. So it is necessary that we have our own medium of expression. And the Black press has done a great job nationally of publicizing the accomplishments of the Black community. Is there something somebody wants to ask me? I might have an answer.
What do you think the biggest challenges are today facing Black newspapers?
Yes.
He said, can you hear? He said, what are the biggest challenges today facing Black newspapers?
What are the what?
He said, what are the biggest challenges today facing Black newspapers?
Well, they haven't changed. I think the challenges are pretty much the same. One thing is your competition for the advertising dollar. Because without that, you know, those little black spots on that white newspaper do not get there for free. It's expensive to publish a newspaper. And the only way you pay for it is that advertising line. And it can be difficult to get. For years and years and years, I tried to get business from a certain company. I'm looking at Mr. Pepper. And not until after the riots was I able to get their advertising. Because we who just weren't important. And that's where it lies. And without that advertising dollar, you can't make it.
May I add something to that?
Yes.
Okay. So I'll just do this. Oops. Okay, never mind. So just go okay.
So yeah, I just wanted to add too that things did change because when we got ready to buy the Cincinnati Herald, P&G was one of the companies that helped us purchase it. So that just shows how things have really changed. Another thing I just wanted to say, another challenge is editorially, because a lot of people still think all black people think alike. What's the black view on something? And when Chris started talking about the two first editors, their names were Russworm and Cornish. They were both abolitionists, but they had totally different views on what black folks should do. So one of them believed, we should stay here and fight. The other one believed we need to all relocate to Africa. And so depending on who was in charge of the paper that year, because it kind of went back and forth, the paper would take a different stance. And at one point, they eventually just fell out completely, and one of them left and just moved to Liberia. But that's still a struggle because we have a lot of different viewpoints. We have liberals, conservatives, right wing, left wing. I mean, everybody. And so when we publish something that someone doesn't like, folks are always ready to boycott. Oh, how could you put that in the paper? Well, that's somebody's opinion. And one of our purposes is to give a voice to everyone. And so that's always a struggle, but very important.
It's easier for me.
Oh,
Okay, thanks. Anybody else? Yes.
So, what's it been like to deal with and either of you can answer this, what's it been like to deal with the financial challenges, considering there's also the financial
yeah, what's it like to
challenges?
deal with the financial challenges?
What is it?
Like to deal with the financial challenges?
How is it to deal with the financial challenges?
Yeah,
That's a
especially
big-
considering that mainstream press as well is also dealing with financial issues as well. Especially.
Yeah, he said, so given that mainstream press is, the papers are getting smaller, a lot of papers are getting sold and really aren't surviving, how's the black press surviving?
The black press, I think, will always survive. Because we fill a unique need. We fill a void that nothing else does fill. And the advertisers realize that. They know that they get their measure from the advertising that they place in the black press.
Right. In fact, for our paper, for the Cincinnati Herald, subscriptions are actually up. And of course, all papers are forced to do online. John was just asking about, the whole online thing. We're online as well, theCincinnatiHerald.com, and we're getting more and more hits. And so that's really important too. I mean, the digital media is a big challenge for me because I'm not really good at that. But we have people in our office, millennials, who really know what they're doing, and so they're when I left the office today, somebody was taping a podcast for us. So I'm like, okay, this is great. So we have people who actually know how to do that, which is very important because we have to change with the times. But it's really interesting. People still want to see the paper in print. I mean, often we'll say to someone, there's not room in the paper for this story. Why don't we put it online? Oh, no, we want to see the pictures in print. We want to see the story in print. Advertisers want to see the paper on someone's table. I mean, we still are really relevant in terms of being in print, but the digital is important as well. But we have not lost subscribers. We've increased. Revenue is up, and I think because, as Mrs. Carm said, we're a niche market, and I think that really helps a lot.
As a matter of fact, when I get the paper every week, I read it from cover to cover. But the first thing I do is go through it and look for those full-page ads.
Right.
Because I know what they mean.
Okay. All right. Well, you know what? Why don't we? Did you want to make a final remark?
No.
Okay.
I want to say how happy I am to be here this evening, and I want to thank you for listening to me, and have a good evening.
that I believe about 6 or 7 times I've been featured in some way in the Herald since I've been here in Cincinnati. So I still have those clippings.
Thank you, Chris.
Without further ado, I'm going to bring John Pepper up. He's going to introduce our lecture for this evening, and then that will be followed by Q&A. I just also want to remark that Etan's book is being sold down in the bookstore. She notified me that she will stay open for the duration of the lecture. So it's a great opportunity to purchase the book and to get it signed. I believe it's $15 plus tax, which is actually a very good discounted price for the book. So I want to encourage you to do that. But without further ado, John Pepper.
John Michelle, thank you so much. Can you imagine anybody at Parker and Gable in front of this woman and she's pitching you on an ad? Imagine saying no. I love what you said. There will always be a black press. Said just that way. There will always be a black press. No doubt about it. February at 100. My God, you're unbelievable. It's all about leadership on everything. This Harold wouldn't be there if it weren't for you, and it wouldn't be continuing if it weren't for you, John Michelle, continuing the way it is vibrant. And I agree with those who want to see it in print. I want to look at that paper, and I was telling Francie, John Michelle, what a pile of stuff you always have in our kitchen. 1,500 magazines and everything else. And that Herald comes in once a week, and I will always pick it off the top and look at the Herald.
Thank you.
Because there isn't something else in it.
Thank you.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. I was about halfway through The Defender. Only about halfway through, and I decided, boy, it would be wonderful if we could bring Ethan, the author, here. I hadn't finished it yet, because I told him earlier this evening, it's a book that I found takes on increasing momentum as you actually go through the book. But halfway through, I knew I hoped he'd come here. I've always had a great belief in the press, including press that's been written by a very important white person. It was called The Race Beat, which talked about the role of the white press, let me emphasize, heavily influenced by the black press at the time of the Civil Rights Movement. And I hadn't known about The Defender. I never heard of it. So I thought it was a story, when I was reading it, this is a story to be told. It's so many different levels, and I won't get into detail. We want to hear from the author, but there's so many lenses through which John tells this story. Horrors that were going on in the South that were brought together and were brought to life in just a cinema-like fashion. Battles for integration, whether it was in unions or baseball, or getting a place in the press club in Washington, and on, and just repression. A lens of how hard it was financially. And this was scrapping every bit. Little desks in warehouse-type offices, ups and downs along the way, nothing lasting in the world from a straight line. But all this comes through in this magnificent book. And I think also what comes through is the influence that Defender had on the white press. And yes, there always needs to be a black press, but that influence of stories that can no longer be ignored because they're being told so viscerally. Lynching was going on that wasn't being covered in the white press. And maybe never adequately was, but it was covered more because of this. When you read the book, I think you won't have any trouble understanding that Tom was an English lit major. Because while this is loaded with history, it is written in a way that, let me just say, it's very readable and eloquently written. I'll let him tell the story of how he got to this, which is kind of a story in itself. It's an extremely well-reviewed book. I would certainly urge you to buy it downstairs. A lot of great reviews. The one that I admired the most, and I gather you did too, was by the extraordinarily well-known New York Times reviewer, Brent Staples. And he wrote one of the most exhaustive reviews I've seen him ever write of this book. And it ended with this. Kaylee, who was white, knew nothing about the glory days of the Negro press, and had been surprised to find while walking through the newsroom for the first time that almost everyone was black. He developed a love for the ailing paper, and for what it is, and the Negro press had once been. This deeply researched, eloquently written history is a testament to that love. It is also a towering achievement that will not soon be forgotten. That's the kind of end of a review that an author likes to see. And I certainly think it is well deserved. So with that, let me invite you up here, and thank you so much for being here in our city and talking to us about this great book.
Can everybody hear me okay?
A little closer.
How about this? Is this better? Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you all very much for coming tonight. Thanks to Chris and to the other staff members here at the Freedom Center. Thanks to John and Francie Pepper for bringing me, and a special thanks to Mrs. Parham and to Jan Michelle for coming and speaking about the Herald. I think that really clearly makes the point that the black press is not just very important history, it's also very much relevant to the situation that we find ourselves in today. I'm going to speak to you today about the Chicago Defender, of course. The Defender, for those of you that don't know, was the newspaper that was primarily responsible for the Great Migration. The movement of African Americans, of hundreds of thousands at first, and then millions of African Americans from the South to the cities of the North. The Chicago Defender was then very important to organizing those African American migrants from the South into a political force, into an electoral power, the likes of which has never been seen since. It was the Defender that brought African Americans from the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln to the Democratic Party of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And it was the Defender that then used the electoral power of those swing voters in northern cities to elect Harry Truman in 1948. It's very much was a legend at the Defender, but it was something I was able to verify in the research that Harry Truman would not have been elected president of the United States without the support of the Chicago Defender. Likewise, John F. Kennedy in 1960 would not have won the presidency without the support of the Chicago Defender. It was the African American vote that's almost single-handedly put John F. Kennedy into office. The Chicago Defender was also important on a cultural level. Its entertainment editor, Earl Calloway, discovered the Jackson 5, among many other great artists. And of course, the newspaper in the 1990s was responsible for giving a start to a young politician named Barack Obama. So the Chicago Defender has played a very important role in our history of the 20th century, but it's a role that I have to say I knew absolutely nothing about when I walked into the Defender for the very first time in 1991. As John mentioned, I was an English lit major at the University of Chicago, and I graduated from the university in 1989. I worked as a substitute teacher in the Chicago Public Schools for a couple of years with dreams of becoming a novelist. However, if you've looked in the newspaper want ads, or today I guess it would be online, and you look under the aspiring novelist section, you'll find the listings are pretty slim. So when a friend approached me, who was also a white Jewish University of Chicago grad, and suggested to me that he might recommend me to be his replacement at a newspaper called the Chicago Defender, because he was going to go work at his hometown newspaper, my first question was, oh, that sounds great. What is the Chicago Defender? Is it a communist newspaper? I asked a little bit hopefully. He said, no, it was an African-American owned newspaper. And I said to myself, well, okay, we're in what I think is a post-racial era. I very naively thought that at the time. And some newspapers will have white owners, and some newspapers will have African-American owners. And I really didn't think that it was going to be that significant of a factor in my tenure at the Defender. But when I got to the Defender's newsroom And I saw for the first time, this was at the time at 24th Street and Michigan Avenue in Chicago, and I saw the portrait of Robert Abbott looking down on me in the lobby. And he was dressed in 1920s garb and just looked spectacular. When I saw the newspapers in the glass case going back to the early part of the 20th century, and frankly filling in the gaps in American history, all the things that I'd said, oh, this is, I heard the official story, of course, in school, but something about those headlines, something about those articles let me see that I had been missing quite a bit. And then when I saw Robert Abbott's words inscribed on the floor of that building at 24th in Michigan, all of that told me I was somewhere special, and it was somewhere that I had to be. There was some, I don't know how to describe it, there was an effort on the part of the city editor at the Defender to overlook my lack of journalistic credentials and bring me into the newspaper, despite my lack of journalistic skills. And it was really the staff at the Chicago Defender that kept me there and educated me, not just in journalism, but in how the country works, how race in the country works, and how American history really figures into our current status. And all of that was really a free education for me, and something that I hadn't anticipated when I came to the newspaper. It was something that I will treasure forever, and treasured even after I left the Defender after 5.5 years. I had covered by that point crime and violence, politics, environmental issues, and had covered for most of the time that I was at the Defender public housing. And I'd gone on from the Defender, I left the Defender to go start the Residence Journal, which was a magazine for and by public housing tenants in Chicago. If you've heard of the Cabrini Green public housing development or the Robert Taylor Homes development, they're both gone now. But those high-rise public housing developments were very much up and alive, places that were alive and vibrant at that time. And I felt very much in the spirit of the Defender that the residents of those buildings needed a voice, and that there was no one better place to be able to do that than I was, because I had been working with the tenants for the last few years through the Defender, knew so many of them personally, and knew what great talents were there in terms of potential writers and photographers and editors. The whole time, however, that I was working at the Residence Journal, and it was 19 years, I still dreamed about doing a book about the Defender. I really believed that that book needed to be out there for the public. It took me a long time to find, first of all, an agent who really believed in the idea, and my agent in New York, Rob McQuilkin, has been there really every step of the way. I like to mention that because not every agent really sticks behind a project the way that Rob did with this book, and really deserves a lot of credit for that. And then it took Rob and I some time to find a publisher. We were able to find a very supportive publisher in Houghton Mifflin Harcourt who waited 6 years while I put this book together. So it was really a labor of love and a team effort from many people to do this. And I'm of course happy with the results. And I should say I would have been happy if there was just a small group of people here tonight, and there was just a small group of people who appreciated the paper. But the large, robust response that we've gotten to the book, and the support that we've gotten from people like you is very heartening and very encouraging, and something that I'll treasure along with the book. So with that, I'll just say that I'd like to go back to the beginning of the story of the Chicago Defender, and to our first photograph, which is right over here. This is Robert Abbott, is the second from my right, the young man with glasses. Robert Abbott, as he appeared when he first came to Chicago for the 1893 World's Fair. Now, if you don't know about the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, it was not just the beginning of Chicago as a modern city. I will argue that it was the beginning of America as a modern nation. It was a place in which the potential for science, for technology, for knowledge, really, in a refined way, was all being presented to the world. And the United States was coming out in a city that until that moment had really been a wilderness. And Robert Abbott was there as a student at Hampton University, which then as now was really one of the premier African-American institutions of higher learning. And Robert Abbott was there as a member of the Hampton Quartet. He was singing at a time that there was no recorded music, there was no amplified music. And the songs that he was singing, which today we refer to as African-American spirituals, these were very popular tunes. And it was, they were songs that were sung by a lot of people, but because of Hampton's intellectual reputation, Robert Abbott had access to the white city. He was able to actually, in the Hampton Quartet, were actually able to go onto the parade grounds and perform there, which meant that Robert Abbott had access to everybody and everything that was at the World's Fair. And as I said, it was a gathering like no other before. There were people from all over the planet there. There were people at every level of intellectual development there. Robert Abbott in particular spent a lot of time with the great Frederick Douglass, the escaped slave, abolitionist, friend of Abraham Lincoln. Frederick Douglass was then 75 years old, still the preeminent spokesperson for African Americans, and was at the height of his powers at the 1893 World's Fair. Now, I should say that this was a dark moment in American history. This was a moment in which the gains of the Civil War that had been so dearly won with blood and treasure were being reversed. Throughout the South, white majority governments, or white minority governments in some states, were taking back control of the apparatus of state government, and step by step circumventing the constitutional amendments that had been put in to guarantee rights for African Americans. The white oligarchs of the South were putting in segregationist laws that would become known as the Jim Crow system, the segregation system. Segregated schools, segregated public facilities, segregated transport, and circumvented opportunities for African Americans in business and other realms. So Robert Abbott was coming to the World's Fair at this moment of great difficulty for the African American community. He was listening not just to Frederick Douglass, who was of course a former newspaper man himself, but also to Ida B. Wells, the great investigative journalist who was just a few years older than Robert Abbott. She actually wrote an investigative booklet for the World's Fair, which was published during the World's Fair, which exposed all of the, not just the lynchings and atrocities that were taking place in the South, but the reasons behind, economic reasons behind those lynchings. She was meticulous in documenting the incidents themselves as well as the motives behind them. And this was something that greatly inspired Robert Abbott as well. And he left the World's Fair determined to, number one, return to Chicago and make it the site of his endeavors, and number two, to create a newspaper in the city of Chicago. I should say that Robert Abbott did not come from a family of means. His stepfather was a man of really a unique background who was of both African and German descent and had been raised in Germany and come to the United States only after the Civil War, where he met Robert Abbott's mother. And Robert Abbott's biological father had died even before Robert was a year old, and Robert's mother remarried the Reverend Sangstack. It was really a love marriage. Reverend Sangstack might have gone back to Germany, where he would have enjoyed full rights as a German citizen. He might even have passed as a white man in the South if he had chosen to do that. His complexion was light enough to do that. But he fell in love with Robert Abbott's mother, who was herself a remarkable woman, who had taught herself to read and write while she was in slavery. And the two of them had many more children together, but the Reverend Sangstack adopted Robert Abbott as his own son and raised Robert Abbott. He became a congregationalist minister, the Reverend Sangstack, and he raised Robert Abbott in the suburbs, really, of Savannah, Georgia, where Robert Abbott got a unique education that really benefited from his stepfather's European outlook and European knowledge. So Robert Abbott had a lot of ambition, a lot of talent, a lot of knowledge, but no money. And it took him many years to get back to Chicago, 5 years of additional schooling and additional effort to get back to Chicago. And then it took him many more years to make the Chicago Defender into a success. I'm going to switch slides. All right. Okay. This is Robert Abbott some years later. You can see here that he's looking quite prosperous. You can see the look of adulation in the eyes of the newsboys, the delivery crew for the Chicago Defender. But it has to be said that for the first few years of the newspaper's history, Robert Abbott really went without food or clothing to make sure that his newspaper had ink and newsprint. He was absolutely determined to get this paper off the ground, even though others were quite skeptical. Many people looked at the techniques that he was importing into the black press, headlines, sections, dividing up the newspaper, in other words, into news and editorial and feature sections, and putting large type headlines over things. Well, these were seen as really gauche, atrocious ways to try to get readers. This was seen as very suspect. And it was really only large publishers like Hearst and Pulitzer who were out there changing the way that newspapers had been done in the past. Now, technologically speaking, it had suddenly become possible to print large quantities of newspapers and print a large quantity quickly and make a profit from that. That's really what Hearst and Pulitzer were able to do with their innovations. And by bringing in these techniques into the black press, Robert Abbott really was just extending the technological innovations of the day. But if you look at not just African American newspapers, but newspapers, other newspapers from that era, you'll see that they were basically one run-on column without headlines to divide the articles up and without sections to indicate whether one section was different for another. Well, this was regarded as the proper way to do a newspaper, and for the first few years, Robert Abbott really did not get a lot of support because he was doing things in a way that was seen as suspicious. But after a number of years, Robert Abbott was able to start turning the Defender into a national communications vehicle for African Americans. He worked with Pullman porters, the famed valets of the train system, who, it has to be said, you can imagine the trains of the 19th and early 20th century. You can't look at the airplanes or even the trains or buses of today. You have to imagine no air conditioning. You have to imagine smoky coal engines. And you have to imagine a lot of noise and rocking back and forth. And somehow the Pullman porters were able to transform these environments, these mobile environments, into five-star hotels with pristine sheets, with pristine tablecloths at dinner, with food that was delicious and freshly prepared. All of this really was a testament to their professionalism and their great ability to, frankly, to make something out of nothing. And the Pullman porters, when they saw the Chicago Defender, they saw an institution or institution in the making that was very much of their own spirit. And so the Pullman porters, one by one, first started bringing newspapers from their journeys back to the Defender's newsroom. Now I have to say that the Defender's newsroom at this time was Robert Abbott's landlady's dining room. Robert Abbott at this time could not afford to have his own office, and it was his landlady, Mrs. Henrietta Lee, who volunteered her dining room as the Defender's first office, which it remained for the first couple of decades of the Defender's existence. So the Pullman porters would come to Mrs. Lee's dining room with their newspapers, and at first, one by one, they would sit there with Robert Abbott and go through each of the papers looking for different articles that they could rewrite from an African American perspective. This was like a wire service, if you can imagine that. And gradually, the Pullman porters also would take copies of the newspaper back out on the rails with them. And I have to say, it's sometimes portrayed as an effort to distribute the newspapers for free, when the Pullman porters were said to sometimes have tossed bundles of newspapers off of the back of the trains or whatnot. I was not able to verify any of those stories. Instead, what I found was that the Pullman porters actually sold subscriptions to the newspaper around the country, which I think is even more significant, right? Because the Pullman porters were going, you have to imagine, to a sharecropper, a small farmer, a small businessman, someone who worked very, very hard for their money, and they were saying to this person, oh, would you please give me one of your hard-earned dollars in exchange for a subscription to a newspaper in far-off Chicago? There was a bond of trust there that would not have been easily created. It was a bond of trust that Robert Abbott regarded as sacrosanct. I mentioned that Robert Abbott would go without food or clothing to make sure that his newspaper would come out on time. He would make sure that every newspaper reached every subscriber on time. And this was something that took supreme effort almost every week, especially in the first few years of the newspaper. And it was by working with those Pullman porters that Robert Abbott was able to establish that bond of trust and to get a nationwide circulation, because of course the porters got to every small African-American community around the country. And wherever they went, they would sell a copy of a subscription to the Defender, or establish a relationship with the store or an entity that could distribute the paper. So it was in that way that the newspaper became a very powerful national communications vehicle. Now, one other note I would like to make about the photo: you can see the look of respect and adulation in the eyes of the newsboys there. That's absolutely real, and it existed for a couple of reasons. One of which was that the Defender, unlike other newspapers, allowed its newsboys to take their newspapers on credit and come back and pay the newspapers once they had sold them all. That was, again, a bond of trust with the community that did not exist with other newspapers or with other newspapers and their communities. So that was something that was very powerful. I was able to speak with, he's still around, Dr. Timuel Black, who's only 98 years old in Chicago. And Dr. Black was not a paperboy for the Defender, but he was an assistant paperboy. His older brother, Walt, was a full paperboy. And at the age of 5, Dr. Black began working with his brother. I asked Dr. Black if, and Dr. Black features in the book quite a bit. He went on to be a soldier in World War II who liberated concentration camps where Jews and others were kept. He went on after the war to become a teacher and an activist, and organized the Chicago contingent to Dr. King's March on Washington in 1963. Dr. Black was very important in Harold Washington's run for mayor to become the first black mayor of Chicago. And Dr. Black was also there to, I'm trying to find the right words, to put Barack Obama on the right agenda when it came to running for president. It was Dr. Black who laid out a couple of items that he felt that State Senator Barack Obama should do before he was ready to go on to the national stage. So I asked Dr. Black about this photo, and Dr. Black said that he could see it, but that his eyesight has deteriorated a little bit such that he does not know if he is one of the paper boys in this photo, but he said he could have been one of the young people in this photo. And the spirit that you see in their eyes, he said, was absolutely real. That Robert Abbott, while he was not a great speaker, while he was not, he did not have inspiring words, his presence in the community in Chicago, his appearance, his impeccable manners, and his dedication to the young people of the city they all understood very clearly that he could have been relaxing somewhere, and instead he chose to come to the newspaper and spend his time with them, and they really appreciated that. I'll go to the next photo. So this is the Chicago Defenders' first headquarters at 34th Street and Indiana Avenue in Chicago. As I mentioned, for the first few decades of its existence, the Defender was in Robert Abbott's landlady's dining room. And as the newspaper became more and more successful, Robert Abbott simply expanded the newspaper into other parts of Mrs. Lee's apartment. When he first became, the paper first started to prosper, the first thing he did was buy Mrs. Lee an apartment somewhere else so that he could, just a couple blocks away, so that he could take over her bedroom first, and then other rooms in the apartment, and then finally other apartments in the building, and make them into a kind of an expanded newsroom. Then came 1919. In 1919, which was known as the Red Summer throughout the country, you had race riots that really were taking place. Now, this is in the wake of the Great Migration, as hundreds of thousands of African Americans have come from the South to the North. There was starting to be conflict in some of the cities and some of the places that had become destinations for the migrants. These were not race riots that were, these were race riots that were quite different from the race riots later in the 20th century. These were race riots in which, it has to be said, young white marauders, gangs we would call them today, were attacking African American neighborhoods. And in Chicago, it was the veterans of, the African American veterans of World War I who established a perimeter around what had, until that point, been a largely integrated 50%, no more than 50% African American neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. But in 1919, with these, in the midst of these race riots, that's when you first started to see entirely African American neighborhoods resulting from that situation. For Robert Abbott, the race riot was a terrifying moment because until that time, he had been printing the newspaper in another neighborhood with a white-owned press. And during the riot, he realized that he could not access that press, that even though the printers were willing to work with him, the white workers on the press were not willing to print the paper, and he wasn't able to physically travel with the page proofs and other items that he needed to get to the plant. Well, this terrified him, again, because of that bond of trust that he had with his readers. So he realized that he had to do something to take control of his own printing. And that's when he began to save every penny, and he was always a saver, but he saved every penny, and after a few years, really after just 2 years, was able to purchase this building with its own brand new Goss press. Here you can see Robert Abbott showing off the press to some visitors. That look that you see on his look of joy, really, and awe, even, when you see Robert Abbott's face looking at the press, that's real. He regarded, this was the first African-American newspaper to own its own printing press, and he regarded that as a great responsibility and something that he really quite cherished. He would go back to the newspaper sometimes in the middle of the night just to stare at the press when no one else was around. And during the day, when people would come to visit the Defender's offices, Robert Abbott would personally greet them, if he was at all able to, and bring them through the building and apparently talk at them until an assistant would come and tell him that it was time to go do something else. But he absolutely loved the press, and he loved the fact that the press was in the midst of this large and prosperous African-American community. I have to say, it's important to point out, I think, that Robert Abbott did not initially support the Great Migration. He understood that there were jobs available because of World War I, in Chicago's factories and in its slaughterhouses because of the end of migration from Europe during that time because of the war, and because of the increased demand for American goods. There were opportunities for African Americans, economic opportunities, but Robert Abbott would not have supported the Great Migration simply for economic gain. He understood that, frankly, there were jobs in Birmingham just like there were in Chicago, and the point of moving to Chicago was not evident to him until he saw that the departure of skilled African American labor from the South could hurt the segregated Jim Crow economy. When he saw that that was possible, he saw that in Jacksonville, Florida, stevedores departed from the port en masse and went to go work at a port in New Jersey. They'd been recruited and realizing that they might have been stopped if they gave 2 weeks' notice, they just disappeared one night. And in the morning, the bosses of the stevedores were caught without anyone to do the work. The bosses themselves couldn't do this skilled labor, and there was no one available to replace them. Well, this caused all sorts of consternation throughout the state of Florida, which tried then to ban recruiters and ban migrants and all sorts of other, migration in other kinds of ways. But when Robert Abbott read this, he said, oh, we can use the migration as a tool to hurt the Jim Crow South. So that's when he endorsed the Great Migration and saw it as something powerful. And that's really what led to this phenomenal growth and prosperity. As we get into the 1930s, the Defender also saw as part of its responsibility to create services for the migrants of a different sort. The Great Depression was raging at this time, and the Defender created, as a service really to the young people of Chicago, the Bud Billiken Parade. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Bud Billiken Parade, but it's a parade that's named for a figurine that was plucked more or less at random from an editor's desk. And it continues today as not just a premier showcase for kids going back to school, but it's also a political showcase like no other. Barack Obama was Grand Marshal of the Billiken Parade twice. And this year, I was personally involved in helping various candidates for political office get a special place that they wanted in the Bud Billiken Parade. Because it's not just that there's an audience of about 1 million people that come to the parade route, it's also that the parade is televised, and so it's seen by a really broad audience around the country. Now, this is from the parade in 1934, and even back in those days, the parade attracted all sorts of celebrities. Duke Ellington up here. But there's also one other thing that I like to note about a couple other things I'd like to note about this photograph. First of all, you can see Robert Abbott here. Now, this is 1934. And you can see that his health has deteriorated quite a bit. He's suffering from a liver disease called Bright's disease, something that we would treat very easily today, but back then was a chronic and ultimately fatal illness. Standing next to him is his nephew, John Sengstack, who's in his early 20s at this point, a fresh graduate of Hampton University himself. And if you notice, Mr. Sengstack is kind of looking a bit askance at this gentleman right over here, who was the Chicago Defender's lawyer at the time. And Mr. Sengstack had just discovered that the lawyer was apparently pilfering funds from the newspaper. And so Mr. Sengstack was getting ready to take control of the newspaper and reinvigorate it as his uncle's health began to decline. Now, this is Robert Abbott on his deathbed. I think this is really one of the photos that along with the photo of the newsboys that I most love. Because again, you can see the respect and adulation on the faces of these men, none of whom would have been trained as journalists. All of them would have come to the Defender with a different profession. Some were attorneys, some worked in hotels, some worked in as I said, as Pullman porters. But they had all come to the Defender and been trained by Robert Abbott to do journalism in the American way, and to make sure that the newspaper had that connection with its community. You can really see that even as Robert Abbott's health is declining, that these men really came and wanted to pay tribute to their leader. Now, Robert Abbott died in 1940. The National Newspaper Publishers Association, he was able to, he started that John Sengstack started the National Newspaper Publishers Association on the day that Robert Abbott passed away in 1940. And it was Robert Abbott's death in 1940 that kind of paved the way for many of the publishers. Maybe Mrs. Parham can correct me if I get this wrong, but that paved the way for many of the publishers to overcome the rivalries that they had and begin to work together to form a larger voice for the black press around the country. The NNPA today is still a vibrant organization representing the black press, and it remains an important voice to speak really for freedom and equality in the country. And you can see, I think, in this newsroom, a couple of things. First of all, you see the gentleman in the front is named Enoch Waters, who was a writer for many African-American newspapers around the country, and wrote a very good book about his experiences at the Defender. But next to him is Audrey Weaver, who would go on to become the first woman city editor of any newspaper in the United States of America. Not any African-American owned newspaper, but any newspaper at a period in the United States. And she was a brilliant woman who Mr. Sengstack prized for her, which I think is something that most publishers prize. She was someone who was able to crank out 3 or 4 stories a day. And so that was something that was really appreciated by her bosses. Now, this is Mr. Sengstack in the Bud Billiken Parade in 1956. And again, it's one of these photographs that captures probably more than 1,000 words. Now, this is 1956. You see here former President Harry Truman, who came really to express his appreciation to Mr. Sengstack for the work that Mr. Sengstack had done in 1948. As I mentioned, the Defender was very important to galvanizing African Americans as an electoral force, particularly the African Americans who had moved to the northern cities, who became the most important swing vote in the United States in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Harry Truman was from Missouri and was not someone who would have automatically received African American support. There were even rumors out there, which Truman heartily denied, that he had been a member of the Ku Klux Klan. So when he came to Mr. Sengstack and asked for Mr. Sengstack's support, Mr. Sengstack, frankly, was not inclined to give it. The Republican candidate, Thomas Dewey, was from New York, was an ardent New Dealer, had expressed strong support for African American rights and for civil rights generally. And Mr. Sengstack made a deal with President Truman. He was already president because Franklin Roosevelt had passed away. The deal was that Mr. Sengstack and the black press, and most importantly, Mr. Sengstack's ally, Congressman Bill Dawson, who was then one of 2 African-American congressmen in the United States at the time, and a very powerful behind-the-scenes player. Bill Dawson and John Sengstack would campaign for Harry Truman if Harry Truman issued an executive order integrating the U.S. Armed Forces and created a commission to make that happen and put Mr. Sengstack on the commission. Well, President Truman agreed to do that. issued the executive order, put Mr. Sengstack on the commission 3 weeks before the election. And the message being, of course, that if President Truman was elected, that this program would continue. If not, it was hard to say what would happen. So Mr. Sengstack and Congressman Dawson went around the country barnstorming for Truman. And when you look at the electoral results, you can see that but for the votes of African Americans in Illinois, in Ohio, and one or two other places, Harry Truman would have lost that campaign and would not have become president. So this appreciation is because Mr. Sengstack was able to get Harry Truman really the presidency. Now next to, on the other side of Mr. Sengstack is Richard J. Daley, the first Mayor Daley of Chicago, who is not known today as a particularly liberal character, but back in those days was someone who actively worked to get African American support, defended civil rights, defended African American access to public housing in the city of Chicago, and would not have won his election for mayor. He defeated a Democratic incumbent in a Democratic primary with African American votes. He won his general election in 1956 and in 1960 because of African American support. So the Bud Billiken Parade and Mr. Sengstack were absolutely essential to that relationship, and that relationship continued, well, it continues even today with Mayor Daley's son, who was of course mayor of Chicago for even longer than the first Mayor Daley, and who maintained a relationship with Mr. Sengstack until he died, and maintains a relationship with the Chicago Defender even today. This is the Defender building at 24th in Michigan, where I worked in the 90s. It's a building that has been I'm really happy to say, has been lovingly restored just in the last few really months, and is now open for business as an events planning space. I went there just a couple of weeks ago for an event for the Chicago Defender charities. It's a great building that was built at a time that this section of Chicago, if you know this section of Chicago, of South Michigan Avenue, this section of Chicago was known as the Automobile Dealers Row in the 1920s. It was a part of the city that was like today's North Michigan Avenue with the Water Tower Place and the kind of fancy stores. Back then, that was what South Michigan Avenue was known for. And it was also a place where there were a lot of automobile dealers where people would go to purchase their cars. So the Automobile Dealers Club, this was the building that was used as their club, and there was a swimming pool there, and a smoking lounge, and various other recreational facilities. There was an area where you could go and, like today when you go to AAA, and do people still do this, and get a map from AAA to go, a route map? You could do that back in those days also in this building. But when the Defender took this building over in the mid-1950s, they turned the smoking lounge into a newsroom. They took the swimming pool out and replaced it with a printing press. Really, the revolutionary moment, I think, is right there where the press is brought in and changes the character of the building. And my desk was, for many years, right over here. The building looks great today. It was in our day, it was a little rougher on the inside. We sometimes had air conditioning and heat, sometimes we didn't. And it was a place where, like any newsroom, I think, around the country, maybe the Herald is different, but like any newsroom around the country, there are not enough resources. We always complained about how cheap the owners were, and we always worked way more hours than we were paid for because we just loved the experience of putting things down on paper and getting them out to the public. I'll go on more, I guess, when we talk about when we have some questions. But it's a building that still today. It was really wonderful to walk through the building another time, and It just, like many things for me with this building, it worked out quite, there's a Yiddish word, besher, which means meant to be. And I was up in the, when I was there just a few weeks ago for the Defender Charities event, just then I got an email that said that they were going to, announcing that they were going to, that the paperback edition of the Defender book will be out this February. And so it was just, felt really a full circle to be in that room and to get that news at that particular moment. Really, really quite wonderful. And this is, of course, Barack Obama at the Bud Billiken Parade. I should say that Barack Obama's first Billiken Parade, he walked with a contingent of about 5 or 6 people. He had no idea really what the parade was, but he very quickly started to understand the power of this parade and the power of the people who attend this parade year after year after year. This is not a crowd that automatically cheers every African American candidate or boos every white candidate. This is a crowd that understands politics, that knows every candidate that is coming before them. They know which Republicans have been reaching out to the African American community, and they know which Democrats have not been reaching out to the African American community. And they take that very seriously, and Barack Obama knew that he had to get the Billiken Parade on his side before he would get any other part of the electorate behind him. And when he understood that, that's when he started to put this kind of effort into the parade. This was already when he was elected to the U.S. Senate. I'm trying to read the signs. Yeah. And he was a state senator, and he was running for the U.S. Senate in this photograph. And he understood that this parade was a showcase like no other. He's here with Congressman Danny Davis and a lot of other local officials from the city, grassroots activists as well. And this was a moment that he really understood that this crowd, this political infrastructure, this organized electorate could take him all the way to the U.S. presidency. And of course, we're in a different era now. We can talk about, I'll say something about that in just a moment. But I think it's important to understand that this is the power that exists within this community, really within this history. And what I mean to say is that we are, of course, at a different moment today politically. I wrote an entire book trying to understand the history of the United States in terms of its racial politics, and I came to see that race is the largest, most important, most definitive force in American history. And I came to see that any time that we've made progress as a nation when it comes to how we deal with race, because race really is just a fiction. It's really just a story that we tell ourselves. It's not real. We know that there's no currency to race in our DNA. We know that there's no currency historically even. Race is something that we created a few hundred years ago, but it's something that is so real to us, something that defines our existence as Americans. And I came to understand that anytime we've made progress, we also had to face a backlash. And so when I think about what happened in this election, I have to tell myself that this is part of that. This is part of that that regular structure of American history, as much as I would like to hope that things are different. That's something that I really have to understand within myself. And I also want to say, before I close on a down note, that the other thing that I really learned from writing this book was that when it comes to progress on race in the United States, the leadership on that, the leadership, in fact, whenever it comes to progress on anything in the United States, has largely been African American leadership. So when I look in this country for leadership, when it comes to progress in this country, I am looking for African American leadership. The population, the African American population of Chicago has dropped significantly from approximately 20%. I see African Americans leaving Chicago in a kind of reverse migration today, something that really is quite heartbreaking. And it also tells me that the leadership, perhaps, I'm sorry to say this as a Chicagoan, but I'm afraid to say that I think that the leadership may move somewhere else as well. It's not that there aren't young Robert Abbotts in Chicago today. I met with one the other day. Daryl Holliday, who's running the City News Bureau in Chicago, has an amazing concept of building a grassroots media organization, which he's in the midst of doing. And if you want to know more about that, I'm happy to tell you about that, and I'm happy to direct you even to Daryl's website and everything else. But the leadership has got to come from young people like that. It's got to come from a community like that that has that level of understanding, that level of history behind it, and that level of dedication and commitment. So, okay, I'll close there, but I'm certainly happy to take questions, and I really hope you guys will, Ms. Parma, hope you'll take questions too if we can direct them your way.